When I married Daniel, I knew I wasn't just marrying a man. I was entering a family with deep traditions and tight bonds. The Thompsons had lived in Boston's Beacon Hill for generations, with a lineage that stretched back to the city's founding days. I was from a small town in Maine, where my parents ran a modest bookstore. The difference in our backgrounds wasn't just geographic. It was a gulf of class and expectation that I naively thought love could bridge. From the moment I met Margaret Thompson, Daniel's mother, I felt her cool assessment. She never raised her voice or made outright objections, but her disapproval hung in the air like a persistent fog. "Sarah isn't quite what we expected for you, Danny," she'd say with a thin smile, using the childhood nickname he'd long outgrown. Her husband, Robert, was kinder, but ultimately deferred to his wife in all family matters. The first 2 years of our marriage, we lived in a small apartment across town. We visited the family home for Sunday dinners and holidays, each visit a careful dance of pleasantries where I tried desperately not to step on any toes. I brought expensive wines I couldn't afford and wore clothes that made me feel like I was playing dress-up. Then came the day when a pipe burst in the Thompsons' historic brownstone, revealing extensive water damage that had been hidden behind the walls for years. The repair estimates were staggering, and I could see the worry etched on Robert's face. He'd recently retired, and their fixed income wouldn't cover such extensive work. I could help, I offered during a tense family dinner. I have some savings, and I work in interior design. I could coordinate everything. The table fell silent. Margaret's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "That's very generous," Robert finally said. "But we couldn't possibly." "I insist," I said, feeling a surge of confidence. "This house is part of your family history. It should be preserved properly." What I didn't say was that I saw this as my chance to finally prove myself worthy of their son, their name, their acceptance. My parents had left me a modest inheritance when they passed away the year before, money I'd been saving for someday starting my own design firm. Instead, I put every penny into the Thompson house. The renovation consumed my life. I took a leave of absence from my job to oversee the work full-time. Every morning, I arrived before the contractors, reviewing plans and making adjustments. I sourced materials that would honor the home's history while modernizing its function. I spent hours hunting down the perfect replica of the original crown molding, insisted on hand-carved newel posts for the staircase, and commissioned custom-stained glass to replace the damaged panels in the front door. "You don't have to do all this," Daniel said one night, as I pored over fabric samples for the dining room curtains. "Mom would be happy with something simple." "I want it to be perfect," I replied, not looking up. What I meant was, I want her to finally see me. Daniel worked long hours at his law firm, leaving me alone with Margaret most days. She hovered as I made decisions, offering commentary that veiled criticism as concern. "Are you sure about that shade of blue? It's rather bold." Or, "That's an interesting choice for the kitchen. Not traditional, but I suppose some people like that modern look." I swallowed each remark and smiled. "We can always change it if you don't love it once it's installed," I'd say, though each change would eat further into my dwindling funds. Robert occasionally pulled me aside with a gentle hand on my shoulder. "The place is looking wonderful, Sarah. We appreciate what you're doing." Those small moments kept me going through the endless days of dust and decisions, contractor disputes and budget adjustments. I began to feel a connection to the house itself, as if by healing its broken places, I might somehow fix what was broken between me and the Thompsons. 6 months and every cent of my inheritance later, the renovation was complete. The house had been transformed. Light now streamed through clean windows into freshly painted rooms. The kitchen gleamed with new appliances that looked vintage but worked with modern efficiency. The garden, once overgrown, now featured a stone path winding through carefully planned beds of native plants. I stood in the center of the living room the day before our celebration dinner, turning slowly to take it all in. For the first time since I'd started, I allowed myself to feel proud. Whatever happened next, I had created something beautiful. "It's really something," Daniel said, coming up behind me and wrapping his arms around my waist. "You've outdone yourself." I leaned back against him, allowing myself to hope. "Do you think they'll like it?" "They'd be crazy not to," he said, kissing the top of my head. The next evening, I dressed carefully in a pale silk dress I'd splurged on for the occasion. As I fastened the delicate pearl earrings Daniel had given me for our anniversary, I rehearsed what I might say when Margaret inevitably offered some backhanded compliment about my work. "Ready?" Daniel asked from the doorway, handsome in his navy suit. I took a deep breath and nodded. Tonight would be different. Tonight, finally, I would belong. The evening air was crisp as Daniel and I walked up the steps to his parents' home, my renovation masterpiece. Light spilled from the windows, giving the brick facade a warm glow against the darkening Boston sky. I squeezed Daniel's hand for reassurance. "You've done an amazing job," he whispered, returning the pressure. "Try to enjoy tonight." Margaret opened the door before we could knock, wearing a navy dress that probably cost more than my monthly salary. Her silver hair was swept into an elegant updo, and her pearls, family heirlooms, gleamed at her throat. "Daniel, darling," she said, embracing him. Then, with considerably less enthusiasm, "Sarah, do come in." The house smelled of roasting meat and fresh flowers. Lilies I'd arranged that morning in crystal vases that had taken me weeks to track down. The living room was already half filled with the Thompsons' friends, mostly couples their age with the same polished Boston Brahmin look. Old money, old connections, old judgments. "Sarah, the place looks absolutely transformed," exclaimed Eleanor Cabot, Margaret's oldest friend. I barely recognized it. So much. Brighter than before. "Thank you," I said, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing server. Another expense I'd insisted on covering. We tried to respect the original character while bringing in some modern elements. "We," Margaret said, appearing at my elbow. "I wasn't aware you had a design partner, Sarah. I just meant Sarah did everything," Daniel cut in. "From hiring the contractors to picking out the doorknobs. It's all her vision." I shot him a grateful look, but Margaret was already steering him away to meet someone's son who'd just made partner at a rival law firm. I stood alone, sipping my champagne and trying to look confident. Robert found me a few minutes later, his kind eyes crinkling as he smiled. "The place has never looked better, Sarah. Truly. I don't know how to thank you. Having you and Margaret happy with it is thanks enough," I said, meaning it despite everything. "Well, I'm more than happy. I'm proud to have you in the family." He patted my arm awkwardly, then moved away as Margaret called for everyone's attention. The dining room table, restored to its original mahogany gleam, was set with the family china and silver. I'd spent hours polishing both, Margaret supervising with running commentary about the proper way to care for heirlooms. Now, 20 people took their seats beneath the chandelier I'd had rewired and restored. "Before we eat," Margaret announced, raising her glass, "I want to thank everyone for coming to celebrate our home's renewal." She paused, looking around the table but not at me. The Thompson house has stood for over a century, weathering storms both literal and metaphorical. It represents our family's enduring presence in this community. I waited for her to acknowledge my contribution, but she simply smiled and sat down. The servers brought out the first course, a soup I'd chosen specifically because Margaret had once mentioned it was her favorite. Conversation flowed around me, but I felt increasingly invisible. Daniel was engaged in a deep discussion with his father's former colleague about some legal precedent. Margaret held court at the other end of the table, occasionally glancing my way with an unreadable expression. By the time dessert arrived, a delicate lemon tart from Margaret's preferred bakery, I was exhausted from maintaining my smile. I stood to help the servers clear the dinner plates, needing a moment away from the table. "Allow me to assist," Margaret said, rising with unexpected grace for a woman in her 70s. She followed me into the kitchen, where the caterers were preparing the coffee service. "Everything has been lovely," I said, desperate to fill the silence between us. "I hope you're pleased with how it all turned out." Margaret picked up a bottle of red wine from the counter, an expensive Bordeaux I'd selected to pair with the main course. "You certainly spared no expense," she said, pouring herself a glass. "One might almost think you were trying to buy your way into our good graces." The kitchen suddenly felt too warm. "That wasn't my intention at all, wasn't it?" She swirled the wine, studying its color in the light. "You know, Sarah, I've been trying to understand you since Daniel brought you home. What exactly do you want from this family?" "Just to be a part of it," I said quietly. "And you think throwing money at our house would accomplish that?" Her voice remained conversational, but her eyes were cold. "Let me be clear. This house, this family, has a history you can't simply purchase your way into. Daniel may be temporarily charmed by your enthusiasm, but eventually he'll remember where he comes from." I felt my cheeks burning. "I love your son. That's all this has ever been about." "Love," she scoffed. "You love what he represents. Stability, status, a step up from your little small-town life." The servers had discreetly vanished, leaving us alone in the kitchen. I took a steadying breath. "I think we should rejoin the party." "By all means." Margaret gestured toward the dining room, glass in hand. "After you." I turned and walked back to the table, where dessert was being served. Daniel glanced up with a distracted smile as I took my seat beside him. I hadn't even taken a bite of my tart when Margaret reappeared. She moved around the table, refilling water glasses, playing the perfect hostess. When she reached me, she paused, standing just behind my right shoulder. It happened so quickly. A splash of cold, then spreading warmth as the red wine seeped through my silk dress. Gasps echoed around the table. I sat frozen, watching the pale fabric turn a violent shade of crimson. "Oh dear," Margaret said, her voice dripping with false concern. "How clumsy of me." I looked up at her, expecting at least the pretense of an apology. Instead, she leaned down, her lips nearly touching my ear, her voice low but clear enough that those nearby could hear. "You don't belong here. You're just a gold digger playing house." The table fell silent. I felt 20 pairs of eyes on me, on the spreading stain, on my humiliation made visible. Daniel sat motionless beside me, his face a mask of shock, or was it embarrassment? I waited for him to say something, to defend me, to acknowledge the deliberate cruelty of what had just happened. He cleared his throat, then reached for his water glass, avoiding my eyes. "These things happen," Robert said weakly from across the table. "No harm done." But harm had been done. I could feel it burning through me like acid, dissolving whatever foolish hopes I'd been clinging to. I rose slowly, placing my napkin beside my untouched dessert. With deliberate care, I smoothed the wet fabric of my dress, then smiled, not at Margaret, but at the table of strangers who had watched my humiliation without a word. "If you'll excuse me," I said, my voice steadier than I could have hoped. "I think I'll go change." I walked out of the dining room with my back straight and my steps measured. Only when I reached the guest bedroom, which I had painted in soft blue and furnished with a reading chair no one would ever use, did I allow myself to recognize the truth that had been spilled along with the wine. I would never be one of them. And perhaps, I realized as I stared at my reflection in the mirror, the stain spreading across my chest like a wound, I never wanted to be. I didn't bother changing out of my ruined dress. Instead, I locked the guest room door and sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the muffled sounds of the dinner party continuing without me. Laughter drifted up the stairs. Someone had made a joke, and life had moved on as if nothing had happened. As if I hadn't been purposely humiliated in front of everyone who mattered to the Thompsons. The wine had dried into a stiff, tacky patch on my silk dress. I ran my fingers over it, feeling the fabric's transformation from smooth luxury to ruined waste. $180 at Nordstrom, purchased with such hope. I'd even practiced what I would say when Margaret inevitably commented on it. "Thank you. It's just something simple I picked up." As if anything in my wardrobe could be dismissed as casually as the Thompsons dismissed their wealth. I looked around the guest room, my favorite room in the renovation. I'd chosen everything. The Benjamin Moore breath of fresh air paint that took 3 coats to get right, the antique bedside tables I'd found at an estate sale in Concord, and refinished myself, the reading lamp with its custom shade that cast the perfect warm glow. I'd spent hours hunting for sheets with the right thread count, a duvet that was substantial but not too heavy, pillows that offered proper neck support. "It's just a guest room," Daniel had said when I showed him the plans. "No one's going to live there." But I'd wanted it to be perfect, a sanctuary for visitors, a testament to my attention to detail and care. Now I was the guest, locked away in my own creation. I moved to the window seat, another of my additions, and looked out at the back garden. Solar-powered lights illuminated the path I'd designed, leading to the small fountain that burbled gently in the darkness. The maple tree I'd insisted on keeping when the landscaper wanted to remove it cast moving shadows on the grass. My phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. "You okay?" 2 words. Not even complete sentences. After 3 years of marriage, after watching his mother deliberately destroy my dress and call me a gold digger, after witnessing my humiliation and offering no defense, he sent 2 words. I didn't reply. Another text came through. "People are starting to leave. Mom says she's sorry about the accident." Accident. The word lodged in my throat like a bone. There had been no accident. Margaret Thompson had looked me in the eye as she tipped that glass. She had meant every drop, every word. And Daniel knew it. He had to know it. Yet he was already rewriting history, transforming his mother's deliberate cruelty into an unfortunate mishap. I heard the front door opening and closing repeatedly as guests departed. Voices called goodbyes. Car engines started. Tires crunched on the gravel driveway I'd had installed to replace the cracked concrete one. The sounds of the evening winding down. A soft knock came at the door. "Sarah?" Daniel's voice. "Everyone's gone. Are you coming out?" I didn't answer. "Sarah, please. Mom feels terrible about what happened." I moved to the door but didn't unlock it. "Does she?" I asked, my voice surprisingly calm. A pause. "Of course she does. It was an accident." "Was it also an accident when she called me a gold digger?" Longer pause. She didn't mean it like that. She'd had a bit too much wine." "How did she mean it then?" "Look, can you just come out? This is silly, talking through a door." "Answer my question, Daniel. How did she mean it?" I heard him sigh, that familiar sound of exasperation he made whenever I pushed an issue he wanted to avoid. "I don't know, Sarah. You know how she gets. She says things without thinking." "No," I said quietly. "She thinks very carefully about everything she says. Every word, every insult is precisely calculated. You're overreacting. It was just a spilled drink and a thoughtless comment." I pressed my forehead against the cool wood of the door. "And what about you? You just sat there. You didn't say a word. What was I supposed to say? Make a scene in front of everyone? Defend your wife, maybe? Acknowledge that what happened wasn't okay?" Another sigh. "Can we please not do this now? I'm tired, and tomorrow's a work day. Go home, Daniel," I said. "I'm staying here tonight." "In the guest room? That's ridiculous. Mom and Dad will think—" "I don't care what they think. Not anymore." I heard him shifting his weight, the floorboard creaking in that spot I'd asked the contractor to fix but hadn't followed up on. "Fine. Have it your way. I'll see you tomorrow." His footsteps retreated down the hall. A few minutes later, I heard his car start and pull away. He hadn't even tried to change my mind. The house grew quiet. I imagined Margaret and Robert preparing for bed, perhaps discussing the evening in hushed tones. Were they talking about me? Was Margaret defending her actions, spinning them into something justified? Was Robert accepting her version of events, as he accepted everything else? I unzipped my ruined dress and hung it carefully on the back of the door. In my underwear, I moved around the guest room, touching the things I had chosen with such care, the curtains with their subtle pattern, the small watercolor of a Maine lighthouse I had found in an art gallery on Newbury Street, the vintage mirror above the dresser. I'd poured not just my money but my heart into this house. Every choice had been an attempt to bridge the gap between the Thompsons' world and mine. Every decision had been made with the desperate hope of finally being accepted. The grandfather clock in the hallway, restored at considerable expense, chimed midnight. I was still wide awake, my mind racing through every interaction I'd had with the Thompsons over the past 3 years. The subtle put-downs, the backhanded compliments, the constant reminders that I wasn't quite good enough. And Daniel, always straddling the line between his family and me, never fully committing to either side. I pulled on the robe hanging in the ensuite bathroom, Egyptian cotton, selected specifically because Margaret had once mentioned liking the weight of it at a hotel in London. Wrapping it around myself, I padded barefoot out of the guest room and down the hall. The house was silent now. Margaret and Robert presumably asleep in the master bedroom at the other end of the second floor. I moved through the darkened hallway, trailing my fingers along the wainscoting I'd had repaired and repainted. down the stairs, each step placed carefully to avoid the creaks I'd mapped in my mind during the renovation. In the dining room, the table had been cleared, but evidence of the dinner remained. A forgotten napkin, a wine glass with lipstick on the rim. I continued to the kitchen where the caterers had left everything spotless. The empty wine bottle, the one Margaret had used, stood by the recycling bin. I picked it up, reading the label by the dim light over the stove. Chateau Margaux, 2015. $300, easily. Money I had spent to impress people who would never be impressed by me. Moving to the study, Robert's domain, which I'd updated with built-in bookshelves and better lighting for his failing eyes, I sat at his desk and opened the bottom drawer where I knew he kept important documents. The folder I was looking for was right where I'd placed it 6 months ago, labeled in my neat handwriting, Home Renovation Documentation. Inside were all the contracts, all the receipts, all the legal papers that outlined exactly what I had contributed to the Thompson family home. The contractor agreements with my signature, the bank transfers from my personal account, the deed modification that Robert had signed without fully reading, distracted by a Red Sox game on TV that granted me partial ownership based on my financial investment. I spread the papers across the desk, illuminated only by the small lamp in the corner. The numbers were staggering when viewed all at once. Nearly $200,000, my entire inheritance, plus what I'd saved from my design work. Money that was supposed to have been my fresh start, my future security. Instead, it had bought me a silk dress stained with wine and the cold certainty that I would never be anything but an outsider to the family I had married into. As dawn began to lighten the eastern windows I'd insisted on restoring rather than replacing, I gathered the papers back into their folder. My decision wasn't emotional anymore. It was clear, calculated, necessary. I would reclaim what was mine. Not just the money, but my dignity, my self-respect. The Thompsons had taken enough from me. They wouldn't take anything more. I returned to the guest room just as the first birds began to sing in the garden. Sitting on the window seat, I watched the sun rise over the neighborhood I had poured my soul into becoming a part of. For the first time since the wine had spilled across my dress, I felt something like peace. They had shown me who they were, who they would always be. Now it was time to show them who I was. I left the Thompson house before Margaret and Robert woke up. Slipping out in yesterday's clothes, I caught an Uber back to the apartment Daniel and I shared near Copley Square. Our doorman, Miguel, raised his eyebrows at my appearance but was too professional to comment. "Good morning, Mrs. Thompson," he said, holding the door. The name jarred me. Thompson. I'd been so eager to take it 3 years ago, thinking it represented my entrance into a new life. Now it felt like a brand I no longer wanted to bear. The apartment was empty. Daniel had already left for work at his Back Bay law firm. I was grateful for the solitude as I showered, washing away the lingering scent of wine and humiliation. As the hot water beat against my skin, I ran through my mental checklist. First, I needed to confirm what I already suspected about the legal documentation. I dressed in comfortable clothes and made a pot of coffee, then sat at our dining table with my laptop. I had digital copies of everything related to the renovation. I'd always been meticulous about record keeping, a habit from my small-town upbringing where every dollar mattered. My fingers flew over the keyboard, pulling up file after file. Contract with the general contractor, signed by me alone. Receipts for materials, all in my name. Bank transfers from my personal account. The inheritance I'd received after my parents' bookstore was sold following their accident. Most importantly, there was the property amendment. 6 months into the renovation, when costs had ballooned beyond initial estimates, I'd suggested a legal arrangement to protect my investment. Robert had been reluctant, but practical concerns had overridden his hesitation. "It's just a formality," I'd assured him at the time. Something my financial advisor recommended. The truth was, I'd never consulted a financial advisor. The idea had come from Lisa, my college roommate who now worked in real estate law. "Never pour money into property you don't partially own," she'd warned during one of our monthly catch-up calls. Especially when family's involved. I hadn't told Daniel about the arrangement. He'd been so distant during the renovation, so uninvolved, that it hadn't seemed necessary. Besides, I'd never imagined I would need to use it as leverage. I'd believed naively that my contribution would be recognized, appreciated, respected. The document was clear. In exchange for funding the renovation, which had significantly increased the property's value, I held a 30% ownership stake in the Thompson family home. Not as a silent partner, but as an active co-owner with rights to access, decision-making authority regarding future modifications, and the option to request financial compensation should I choose to relinquish my stake. I printed the document, along with supporting materials, and placed everything in a folder. Then I called Lisa. "It's been a while," she said when she answered. "How's life among Boston's elite?" "Not quite what I imagined," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I need your help with something. Professionally." There was a pause. "That doesn't sound good." "It isn't." I gave her a condensed version of what had happened, sticking to the facts, though my voice wavered when I described the wine incident. "Jesus, Sarah," Lisa said when I finished. That's beyond awful." "I know, and I'm done. I want out of the house situation, possibly the marriage. But first, I need to protect what's mine." "The property amendment," she said immediately. "I remember you mentioning it. Do you have a copy?" "Right in front of me." "Good. Forward it to my work email. I'll review it and call you back within the hour." I sent her everything, then waited, pacing our apartment. It was a beautiful space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, but Daniel had chosen it before we met. I'd never felt it was truly mine, despite the touches I'd added over the years, the bookshelves filled with my literature collection, the framed photos of my childhood in Maine, the colorful throw pillows Daniel tolerated but never liked. Lisa called back 40 minutes later. "The document is solid," she said without preamble. "You have every right to enforce your ownership stake or demand compensation for relinquishing it." "What's my next step?" "Normally, I'd suggest a conversation first. But given what you've told me about your in-laws," she hesitated. "Sometimes a formal notice creates the necessary impact. It establishes that you're serious and prevents them from dismissing your claims." "A formal notice," I repeated. "You mean like a legal letter?" "Exactly. I can draft it for you today. It would outline your rights under the property amendment and request a meeting to discuss how to proceed." I thought about Margaret's face as she spilled the wine, the contempt in her eyes as she called me a gold digger. I thought about Daniel's silence, his unwillingness to defend me, his text referring to his mother's deliberate act as an accident. "Do it," I said. "Make it clear that I'm not bluffing." "It'll be ready by this afternoon," Lisa promised. "But Sarah, have you thought about what this means for your marriage? Daniel might not take kindly to you asserting legal rights against his parents." I looked at the framed photo on our mantel. Daniel and me on our wedding day, both smiling, his arm around my waist. I'd been so hopeful then, so certain that love would be enough to bridge the chasm between our worlds. "If he can't understand why I need to do this," I said slowly, "then maybe our marriage isn't what I thought it was." After hanging up, I sent a text to my boss at the design firm where I worked, requesting a personal day. Then I sat at our dining table and began drafting my own letter to accompany Lisa's legal notice, a personal message to the Thompsons explaining my decision in terms even Margaret couldn't misconstrue. The words flowed easily, without anger or bitterness, just a clear-eyed assessment of what had happened and what would happen next. I didn't mention the wine or the insult specifically. I didn't need to. They would know exactly why I was doing this. Lisa called again at 3 o'clock. "It's ready. I've attached it to an email, along with instructions for service." "Service?" "You could mail it, but given the circumstances, I recommend hand delivery. It creates a record that they received it, and frankly, it sends a stronger message." I thought about it for a moment. "I don't want to deliver it myself. You don't have to. There are professional services for this sort of thing." I've included a recommendation in the email. An hour later, I'd arranged for a courier to deliver the documents first thing the next morning. The service promised to photograph the delivery as proof of receipt. It would cost me $200, money I could ill afford after emptying my savings for the renovation, but it would be worth every penny. That evening, Daniel came home later than usual. I was sitting in the living room, reading or pretending to read. He looked tired, his suit rumpled, his tie loosened. "You disappeared this morning," he said, dropping his briefcase by the door. Mom was worried. I nearly laughed at the absurdity of it. Was she? She wanted to apologize about last night. The wine, what she said. She feels terrible. Does she? I set my book aside. Or does she feel terrible that I didn't just absorb it and move on, like I usually do? Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. Can we not do this tonight? It's been a long day. It's been a long 3 years, I replied, standing up. But don't worry. After tomorrow, things will be different. He frowned. What does that mean? What's happening tomorrow? I smiled, thinking of the courier who would arrive at the Thompson doorstep with documents that would change everything. You'll see. Daniel left early the next morning, his questions from the night before still hanging in the air between us. He'd tried to press me about what I meant, but I'd remained vague, retreating behind a paperback, and then feigning sleep when he came to bed. He'd lain beside me, a careful 6 inches of space between our bodies, before eventually drifting off. I waited until I heard the front door close behind him before getting up. The delivery service had confirmed via email that their courier would arrive at the Thompson residence between 8:30 and 9 a.m. Margaret was an early riser. She'd be up, possibly working in her garden or organizing her day. Robert, too, would be awake, likely reading the Boston Globe in his study with a cup of black coffee. I imagined them answering the door, the courier handing over the sealed envelope with its official-looking letterhead. Would they open it immediately? Or would they wait, setting it aside with the day's mail, not realizing its significance until later? At 8:15, I walked to the small cafe on the corner of our block. The morning was bright and clear, with that particular crispness that comes to Boston in early fall. I ordered a latte and a blueberry muffin, then took a seat by the window where I could watch people hurrying to work, tourists consulting maps, students with backpacks heading to nearby Emerson College. My phone buzzed at 8:47, a notification from the delivery service. Package delivered successfully at 8:45 a.m. Photo confirmation attached. I opened the attachment. There was Margaret, hair perfectly styled even at this hour, standing in the doorway of the house I'd renovated. Her expression was neutral. She hadn't yet opened the envelope the courier was handing her. Robert stood slightly behind her, peering over her shoulder with mild curiosity. I set my phone down and took a sip of my latte. It was done. There was no going back now. For the next hour, I sat in that cafe, watching the world go by, feeling strangely detached from my own life. I didn't check my phone again, though I knew it would soon start buzzing with calls and texts. I wanted this moment of peace, this interlude between action and consequence. Finally, at 10:15, I gathered my things and headed back to the apartment. As I walked, I thought about what might be happening at the Thompson house. Had they called Daniel yet? Were they frantically consulting their own lawyers? Was Margaret pacing the living room, her face flushed with anger and disbelief? The legal notice was clear and unambiguous. It stated my ownership stake in the property based on my financial contribution to the renovation. It outlined my rights, including the right to access the property at any time, the right to be consulted on any future modifications, and the right to demand compensation should I choose to relinquish my stake. It requested a formal meeting within 7 days to discuss how to proceed. My personal letter, which I'd included with Lisa's legal document, was equally clear. I explained that I had never intended to exercise these rights, that I had invested in the renovation out of love for Daniel and a desire to be accepted into his family. I described without accusation but with painful accuracy how that desire had been repeatedly rebuffed, culminating in the events of the dinner party. I stated that I was now requesting either full recognition of my ownership stake, with all that entailed, or financial compensation equivalent to my investment, plus a reasonable appreciation value as determined by an independent assessor. My phone rang as I entered our building. Daniel. I let it go to voicemail. It rang again immediately, then again. On the 4th call, I answered. What the hell is going on? His voice was tight with barely controlled fury. My parents just called. They're saying you've served them with some kind of legal notice about the house? That's correct, I said, stepping into the elevator. I'm exercising my rights under the property amendment your father signed last year. What property amendment? What are you talking about? The document that grants me partial ownership of the house based on my financial contribution to the renovation. Your father signed it. It's all perfectly legal. The elevator doors opened onto our floor. I walked down the hallway to our apartment, Daniel's shocked silence filling my ear. You can't do this, he finally said. That's my family's home. It's been in the Thompson name for generations, and now it's partly in the Carter name, I replied, using my maiden name for the first time in years. That's how investments work, Daniel. Your father understood that when he signed the document. He never would have signed if he'd known what you were planning. I unlocked our apartment door and stepped inside. I wasn't planning anything. I was protecting myself, and after what happened at that dinner party, I'm glad I did. It was a stupid accident. My mother apologized. Did she? I set my purse down on the counter. When exactly did she apologize? Because all I heard was you saying she felt terrible. That's not the same thing. Daniel made a frustrated sound. I'm coming home. We need to talk about this face to face. Fine. I'll be here. While waiting for Daniel, I moved methodically around our apartment, gathering important documents. My birth certificate, passport, the deed to my parents' old property in Maine that I'd kept for sentimental reasons. I placed them in a secure folder, along with a flash drive containing copies of all my financial records. Then I packed an overnight bag with essential clothing and toiletries, not because I planned to leave today, but because I wanted to be prepared for whatever came next. Daniel arrived 40 minutes later, his face flushed, his tie askew. He burst through the door like a storm. What is wrong with you? He demanded. My mother is beside herself. Dad's talking about getting his own lawyer. Do you have any idea what you've done? I sat calmly on our sofa, hands folded in my lap. I've stood up for myself, something I should have done a long time ago. By threatening my parents with legal action? By claiming ownership of their home? I'm not claiming anything that isn't legally mine, I said. Every penny of my inheritance went into that house. $200,000, Daniel. Money my parents left me after working their entire lives in that little bookstore. Money that was supposed to be my future. He paced the living room, running his hands through his hair. So this is about money? You're after some kind of payback? It's about respect, I said quietly. Something your family has never shown me, and something you've never expected them to show me. That stopped him. He turned to look at me, his expression a mix of anger and confusion. What are you talking about? They've always been perfectly civil. Civil? I laughed, the sound hollow even to my own ears. Your mother deliberately poured wine on my dress and called me a gold digger in front of a room full of people. And you sat there and did nothing. She was upset. The renovation cost more than expected, and she felt like you were taking over. Taking over? It was my money, Daniel. My design expertise. My time and effort. Every single day for 6 months while you were too busy at the firm to even notice what was happening. He shook his head, as if trying to clear it. This isn't you, Sarah. You don't do things like this. You're not vindictive. I'm not being vindictive. I'm protecting what's mine. There's a difference. His phone rang. His mother's ringtone. He glanced at it, then back at me. I need to take this. Of course you do, I said, standing up. You always do. As he answered the call, stepping into our bedroom for privacy, I looked around the apartment we'd shared for 3 years. So many memories. So many moments when I'd convinced myself that things would get better, that eventually I would be truly accepted into the Thompson fold. Now I knew better, and whatever happened next, I wouldn't be the one apologizing. The next 2 days passed in a blur of tense conversations and strained silences. Daniel alternated between trying to convince me to withdraw the legal notice and avoiding me entirely, spending long hours at his office and returning home late, smelling faintly of scotch. I remained firm, neither apologizing for my actions nor engaging in the circular arguments he attempted to initiate. On the 3rd day, I received an email from Robert's lawyer requesting a meeting. I forwarded it to Lisa, who immediately called me. This is good, she said. It means they're taking you seriously. Should I meet with them alone? Absolutely not. I'll be there with you. We need to present a united front. We arranged to meet at Lisa's office in downtown Boston, neutral territory away from both the Thompson house and my apartment. The meeting was set for the following afternoon. That evening, Daniel came home earlier than he had since the notice was delivered. He looked tired, the circles under his eyes pronounced against his pale skin. "I spoke with Dad today," he said, loosening his tie as he sat across from me at our dining table. "He wants to resolve this quickly and quietly." "That sounds reasonable." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "He's prepared to buy out your stake in the house. He's having it appraised to determine a fair value." I nodded. "That's one option. I'll need my own independent appraiser to confirm the valuation." "Jesus, Sarah." He ran a hand over his face. "Is this really necessary? This scorched earth approach? These are my parents we're talking about." "Yes, your parents. The ones who have treated me like an interloper since the day we met. The ones who took my money, my time, my effort, and then humiliated me in front of their friends." I kept my voice even, determined not to let emotion overtake me. "What would you have done in my position, Daniel? Just walked away from everything I invested?" "I would have talked to me first," he said. "Not ambushed everyone with legal documents. Like you talked to me before your mother poured wine on my dress? Like you defended me when she called me a gold digger?" I stood up, suddenly unable to remain still. "We're beyond talking, Daniel. We've been beyond talking for a long time." The meeting the next day was coldly professional. Robert and Margaret arrived with their attorney, a silver-haired man named Harrison Wells, who had apparently handled Thompson family legal matters for decades. Daniel wasn't present. He'd claimed a client emergency, though I suspected he simply couldn't bear to witness the proceedings. Margaret looked smaller somehow. Her usual imperious demeanor dimmed. She avoided meeting my eyes, focusing instead on arranging and rearranging her leather portfolio on the conference table. Robert, by contrast, studied me openly, his expression a mix of confusion and something that might have been respect. Lisa took control of the meeting immediately, outlining my position with a clarity and force that made me grateful, once again, for our long friendship. "My client has invested significantly in the Thompson property," she concluded. "She is entitled to either recognition of her ownership stake with all associated rights or appropriate financial compensation." Harrison Wells cleared his throat. "The Thompsons acknowledge Mrs. Thompson's contribution to the renovation," he said, using my married name deliberately. "They are prepared to offer financial compensation in the amount of $250,000, representing the original investment plus a reasonable return." Lisa glanced at me. We had discussed beforehand what would constitute an acceptable offer. The figure was at the low end of what we'd considered fair, but not insultingly so. "Before my client responds," Lisa said, "I believe Mrs. Thompson has something she would like to say." All eyes turned to me. I had rehearsed this moment, knowing it might be my only opportunity to speak directly to the Thompsons without Daniel present. "The renovation was never about money for me," I said, looking first at Robert, then at Margaret. "It was about creating a beautiful home for a family I hoped would become my own. I put everything I had into that house, not just financially, but emotionally. I believed that if I proved myself worthy, I would finally be accepted." Margaret's hands tightened around her portfolio, her knuckles white. Robert's expression remained unchanged, but he nodded slightly, encouraging me to continue. "What happened at the dinner party made it clear that no amount of effort on my part would ever be enough. I'm not looking to punish anyone. I just want what's fair." The room fell silent. Finally, Robert leaned forward. "The offer stands," he said quietly. $250,000. We can have the funds transferred within 48 hours. I looked at Lisa, who gave me an almost imperceptible nod. "I accept," I said. Harrison began outlining the terms of the settlement, a legal release of my ownership claim in exchange for the payment, plus a confidentiality agreement binding all parties. As he spoke, Margaret suddenly raised her hand, cutting him off. "I'd like a moment alone with Sarah," she said, her voice strained but determined. Robert looked startled. "Margaret, I don't think it's important," she insisted. Then, to my surprise, she added, "Please." Lisa raised an eyebrow at me. I hesitated, then nodded. 5 minutes. The others filed out of the conference room, leaving Margaret and me alone. She sat stiffly, her perfect posture a shield against vulnerability. "I won't apologize for protecting my family's home," she began. "I never asked you to. But," she continued as if I hadn't spoken, "what I did at the dinner party was unforgivable." The whine was deliberate. The words were inexcusable. I hadn't expected this admission. Why are you telling me this now? Because you deserve to hear it. She met my eyes directly for the first time. You're right about one thing. I never gave you a fair chance. From the moment Daniel brought you home, I decided you weren't good enough for him, for our family. I was wrong. It's a little late for that realization, don't you think? She nodded. A quick, jerky movement. Far too late. But I wanted you to know that this, she gestured at the legal documents on the table, has forced me to see things differently. You're stronger than I gave you credit for. Smarter, too. I didn't know what to say. After years of subtle derision and outright hostility, Margaret Thompson was finally looking at me with something approaching respect. And it had only taken a legal threat to get there. I wish things had been different, I said finally. I really did love your house. And your son. Do you still love Daniel, I mean? The question caught me off guard. Did I? The past few days had revealed so many cracks in our relationship, so many moments when he had chosen his family's comfort over my dignity. I don't know, I answered honestly. Right now, I'm focusing on what comes next for me. Margaret nodded again, then stood. The others can come back in now. We've said what needed to be said. The remaining details were settled quickly. I would receive the payment within 48 hours. In exchange, I would relinquish all claims to the Thompson property. The entire matter would remain confidential. As we prepared to leave, Robert approached me, offering his hand. I'm sorry it came to this, he said quietly. For what it's worth, I always thought you did a magnificent job with the house. I shook his hand briefly. Thank you for saying so. Outside, as Lisa and I walked toward the parking garage, she bumped my shoulder gently with hers. You okay? I will be, I said, realizing as I spoke that it was true. This was never about the money. I know, but the money doesn't hurt, especially considering what comes next. What came next was harder than I had anticipated. Daniel and I circled each other in our apartment for several days, both aware that something fundamental had shifted, but neither ready to name it. He alternated between sullen silence and desperate attempts at reconciliation, suggesting couples therapy, a vacation, even moving to a new city to start fresh. It's not about where we live, I told him during one of these conversations. It's about who we are together, who you become when your family is involved. I can change, he promised. I can stand up to them more. But you shouldn't have to stand up to them on my behalf, I replied. That's the whole point. A marriage should be a partnership. When your mother attacked me, your instinct was to protect her, not me. He had no answer for that. A week after the settlement, I found an apartment in Cambridge, across the river from Boston proper. It was small but bright, with a bay window overlooking a tree-lined street. The security deposit and first month's rent barely made a dent in my settlement money. I hired movers to pack up my personal belongings while Daniel was at work. He came home to find half our apartment emptied, my books gone from the shelves, my clothes missing from the closet. He called immediately, his voice tight with panic and anger. You're just leaving? Without even talking about it? We've been talking for days, Daniel. Nothing has changed. So that's it? After 3 years of marriage, you're just walking away. I closed my eyes, leaning against the wall of my new apartment, surrounded by boxes and uncertainty. I'm not walking away. I'm walking toward something else, something better. And what about us? Don't I get a say in this? You had your say when you sat silent at that dinner table, I replied softly. When you chose your mother's version of events over what you saw with your own eyes. He was quiet for a long moment. I do love you, Sarah. Despite everything. I know. But love isn't always enough. We agreed to meet with a mediator to discuss the terms of our separation. The divorce, when it came, was as amicable as such things can be. Daniel didn't contest the settlement money, acknowledging that it was rightfully mine. In return, I made no claim on our joint assets beyond what I had brought into the marriage. 6 months later, I opened a small interior design studio in Cambridge, specializing in thoughtful renovations of historic homes. The irony wasn't lost on me, but I found I still loved the work, transforming spaces, honoring their history while making them functional for modern life. Occasionally, I drove past the Thompson house, usually on my way somewhere else. I never stopped, never lingered, but I allowed myself a moment to appreciate the maple tree in the backyard, now thriving, its leaves turning gold and crimson in the fall light. I had fought for that tree when the landscaper wanted to remove it. It felt like the only victory that had truly lasted. I heard through mutual friends that Margaret had taken up gardening more seriously since I left, spending hours tending to the flower beds I had designed. Daniel had moved to New York for a position at another firm. The house remained in the Thompson name, as it had for generations. Sometimes, when I unlock the door to my own place, a modest condo I purchased outright with what remained of the settlement, I think about that dinner party, about the wine spreading across my silk dress, about the words that burned. I think about the night I didn't sleep, the decision I made as dawn broke. I don't regret it. Any of it. Not the renovation. Not the legal notice. Not even the end of my marriage. Each step led me here, to a life built on my own terms, where no one can make me feel small or unwelcome, where I belong, simply because I say I do.